This is Theology Bits, a ministry of Central Lutheran Church, Eugene, Oregon. I'm Pastor Ben. This week, in this video, is our second in this series, Stories of Creation in the Bible. And today we're going to be focusing on the book of Job. And this is really where this series gets going, because last time we talked about Genesis 1 and 2. That's the story of creation that most people know. Now we're going to look at some other stories of creation that we have in the Bible. Some might not even be familiar that they're there. Today we'll be focusing on the book of Job, chapters 38 to 41. A little overview of Job. It's too much to overview, but Job brings a reeve, or a covenant lawsuit against God. And what Job sees is that he has acted in a manner that precludes righteousness, but he has not received blessings from God. And Job knows his covenant, he knows his Sinai covenant, and he reads that, especially if you're looking at the book of Deuteronomy, and you would say, if I'm following the covenant, if I've been right before God, I should be receiving blessings. Instead, he seems to be suffering and things are not going well for him. And so Job takes God to court. And we're going to find throughout the whole book that it's actually quite a creational book. That is, the primary dialogue that sets this up is in the council of the gods, which sounds really odd. Maybe God's in quotation marks, meaning there is one God, but there is this divine assembly, these other people there, and God has a dialogue with this one called the adversary, saying, have you considered my servant Job? Really quickly, your translations don't call him the adversary or the accuser. They give the sound, the Hebrew sounds, which is ha-satan, and so sometimes it's translated simply as Satan. However, if you look at the book of Job, this clearly is not the kind of medieval picture of Satan that people often think of. It's just a noun that means the adversary and is somehow in relationship with God. Now, let's look at what happens in this book, because in chapters 38 to 41, notice the very end, probably to Job's surprise, when Job brings this covenant lawsuit to God, God actually shows up. God does come to court, if you want to say that way. And we're going to find his response is a story of creation. And so, first thing he says to Job is, you gird up your loins like a human. Meaning, be a human, and I'm going to explain to you what it means to be God. And so it starts with a question that God poses to Job. You've brought a lawsuit against me. Where were you when I created all things? How do you know how creation works? And there's going to be a lot of examples that God presents. And it's an aggressive kind of narrative that just keeps on ratcheting upon Job more and more the things that humans, be like a human, aren't going to understand. So, for example, where were you when I laid the foundation of the earth? When I measured it? Where were you when I set the pillars onto the earth? In a lot of language of shutting off the sea, a lot of language of doors and gates, shutting up those moments of chaos and constraining them. Where were you when I set the dawn and the dusk, meaning time? How about light and darkness? Again, with language of shutting up the darkness, closing that door. Then it starts to get into other, I'll use a different color because it kind of shifts, into these are kind of historical things, what has been done, and now we get into what is continuing to be done. What about snow and precipitation, rain, and where the water goes? How about when frost will come or floods? And then it goes into the world around them that anyone can see. How do you know? How can you understand things like animals? The predator and prey, and which goes to which. Or when animals reproduce and how. Do you know when each of the animals are going to give birth and when? What about the wild animals, the ones you can't understand at all, that God has a plan for? And then he's going to go to what we would call almost mythical creatures. That is, these almost otherworldly figures, but that are within you. There's no good English translation. Behemoth, Leviathan. These great beasts. And the message that God created Behemoth. What this is really immaterial, but it's this great monster, the culmination of creation that is beyond all things that God created. And then there's this Leviathan, this sea monster, that doesn't have God creating, it has God constraining. Could you, human, go catch Leviathan? Could you subdue Leviathan, this sea monster that was associated, by the way, with the place of the dead? And so we have this language that comes up of, first, historically, what is it? How was it created? And then, how are things happening now? And then we get toward, and what do you observe in your own life that you understand or don't? And then we have the great, we might call the great challenges or the great forces that are facing you as you live on in your life. Do you understand those? And see, that question keeps on coming up about what we would call wisdom. Do you understand? And the reason God brings up all this stuff about creation is, do you understand? And the goal is obviously for Job to grow in that knowledge. For Job to understand something he didn't understand before. A very different reason for bringing up creation. Remember, Genesis 1 and 2 was about how the world is structured that we are living in. Here it's, how can you appreciate what it means to be a human? How can you appreciate and understand different aspects of who God is? That there is indeed a plan, much like in Genesis 1, that all of these things God did, God has deliberately done. That there is some obvious power to who God is, especially with these things, these great beasts, these great monsters. And we have, further, do you understand your place and God's place? And then we will find the biggest point, remembering what Job's doing, bringing this covenant lawsuit. God will not be constrained to some kind of pre-existing covenant that you thought you understood. Now, some of you would say, hey, wait a minute, I thought if God said something earlier, God would never go back on it. Well, that's theologically good theology, but the book of Job would say, well, maybe that's true, but can you understand it enough? And the way to show that is the expansiveness of creation itself. And the point, though, that I do want to make sure that we understand is that in this depiction of creation, in the book of Job, it is not about the past. Genesis 1 and 2, you can get the idea that creation was something that God did a really long time ago and then stopped doing. Here, creation is the active role of God in the world. Notice, the covenant is not the active role of God in the world, it's the creation. God is continually looking at the way in which animals and snow and rain and frost and floods, and this foundation was just a foundation for God to continue acting. Job feels abandoned, that he has been righteous, but God is not responding, saying, not only have I not abandoned you, but I am always active in this world, but in the grandest sense, in creation. That is very different than some sort of question about a historical past, of understanding how things started. This really is not about how things started. How things started is a foundation in order for you to understand who you are in the present. So this is a very different emphasis than what we've had before, and it shows another angle to how creation is thought of and used in the Bible. Stay tuned for more stories of creation in the Bible with other emphases. This has been Theology Bits. I'm Pastor Ben.